From June 8th to the 11th, leading dissident journalists and thinkers will join an all-star lineup of comedians at the first annual Icarus Festival in Rutherford, New Jersey at the William Carlos Williams Center. Co-sponsored by the Gray Zone and Compact Magazine, Icarus Fest will feature Max Blumenthal and Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone, Michael Tracy, Ben Burgess, Sam Husseini, Jeremy Kaufman, Clint Russell, and Meg Smaker, the director and producer of Jihad Rehab, who will discuss and debate the new wave of censorship, the war on terror, the war in Ukraine, and the new world order that has emerged from them. Taking the Icarus stage to discuss the culture and politics of neoliberalism will be Jeff Schellenberger of Compact Magazine and Jack Mason of the Perfume Nationalist podcast. The Icarus Comedy Night features America's comedian Kurt Metzger, Lou Perez, Rich Voss, Danny Polishuk, and Dan Natterman. There will also be film screenings of classic works of cinematic art, a cash bar, and dinners and after parties for VIP ticket holders. For more information, to buy Icarus Fest merch, and to get your tickets before they're sold out, go to IcarusFest.com. That's IcarusFest.com. We'll see you there. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. My guest this week has been thoroughly canceled for making a film that many people, including me, consider to be the very finest examination of the lives of the men who fought with Al-Qaeda. This is my interview with Meg Smaker. I am joined from an undisclosed location, and we can talk about why, in Northern California by Meg Smaker, who is the director and producer of a film that has two names. And I'm sort of curious as to why you did rename it. I want to get into that in a second. But it was originally Jihad Rehab, and that's how I knew it when it came out and made a huge splash. And everybody in my world was talking about it, and it was all controversial. And that's all I knew about it. I didn't see it, but I heard about it. And then we during the Icarus Fest planning, it became a possibility to have you screen the film, which is effectively canceled now. So it's a great opportunity. It, as I said, made a huge splash. Lots of people are talking about it, but you can't see it because it's canceled. But we will be showing it at Icarus Fest June 10th in Rutherford, New Jersey, the Williams Center. And if you want to come see it, go to IcarusFest.com. And Meg here will be there, and she will be talking about it with an incredible panel of experts on the Middle East and the war on terror and American foreign policy and all this. So let's talk about, let's just tell the story, the basic story, and then let's get back deeper into it later. But just to orient people, it was originally Jihad Rehab, and now it's the Unredacted. So just tell us the story of the film and what happened to you. And it came out last year, so this is all very recent. Yeah. What's happened in the last year with you in this film?
So the film originally came out in January 2022, and it was selected to premiere at Sundance Film Festival. The film was originally called Jihad Rehab, and it's about the world's first rehabilitation center for terrorists located in Saudi Arabia, and it follows a group of men who were in Guantanamo for 15 years, and they are released then to Saudi Arabia to go through this rehab program. So I follow them for about a year and a half in the rehab program, and then a year and a half after they get out, when they try to find jobs and a wife and start a family, and to see, you know, their trajectory over those 3 years. So yeah, I was in Saudi Arabia for 3 years filming them, and it's a very character-driven film. So I think a lot of times when people talk about the subject of terrorism, they kind of think about these very kind of more Alex Gibney, more kind of deep dive investigative journalism about facts and dates and uncovering stuff. And for me, as a filmmaker and as a storyteller, I never want to tell a story that's already been told. And so when I kind of looked at the catalog of things that had been done on this subject, I realized that there was something missing in kind of the catalog, and also our understanding of not just the war on terror, but of these men. And it was actually hearing from these men themselves and their perspective. And I think that that's, I mean, for anyone who's read Sun Tzu, Art of War, it's really important to like know the people who, you know, are have attacked you or you're at war with, or all the other kind of stuff. So yeah, and I think that the way that I kind of like my goal for the film was to basically try to understand these men on a human level and their motivations and why they did what they did and kind of their emotional trajectory over this specific time. And yeah, and so that's basically what the film kind of aims to do. And the one of the things that I try to kind of like explain to people, because they're very surprised when they see the film, about how like there's not a lot of politics in it. It's just literally these guys over 3 years. And the reason for that is I remember studying World War II in high school, and my teenage brain could not wrap my mind around 6 million people being murdered. That was just not something that I could actually kind of internalize and really, really understand until I read Anne Frank. And that's just one person's story over a short amount of time, but it allowed that human connection and that kind of that tangibleness of what the ripple effects of the conflict of that war were on like a normal human being. And I think, you know, we've been fighting the war on terror for over 2 decades. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. Again, it's a really hard thing to wrap your head around. And so what this film kind of aims to do is to try to make that understanding more accessible on a human level. Because I think up until this point, we've kind of just been talking about numbers and strategies and tactics. And I think that you can find all that stuff online in terms of the history and the context. But the thing that was missing for me anyway was that human understanding. And I don't know if does that make sense?
Oh, no, completely. And I was about to say, so like a lot of people, I've been following the war on terror pretty much every day for more than 20 years. And I don't think I've ever seen or heard from an individual Islamic jihadist terrorist. I don't know what these guys are like. Before your film, I had no idea how they thought. Of course, all we would do, those of us who would analyze this thing, is try to figure out what's in these guys' heads. Why are they doing this? Why are they strapping bombs to their bodies? Why are they flying planes into buildings? Why have they committed their lives and their deaths to this? And now, for the first time, we actually look at them in the face through your film and hear from them, and they are exceedingly human, turns out, at least the 4 guys that you feature in the film. In fact, it's generally, while I'm watching it, I have to remind myself, oh, this guy was in Al-Qaeda. Oh, this guy blew people up, you know, with a bomb. In fact, there's one moment where one of them admits to
that's the guy who opens the film, Khaled. He was one of the lead bomb makers and bomb instructors for Al-Qaeda, and he knew Osama bin Laden. And it's really interesting because there's this quote that used to be in the film, but I took it out because it didn't belong there. But it was kind of summed up what the film is in kind of one sentence, which I always really like, very pithy things. It's a quote by Dostoevsky from, I think, Crime and Punishment, and he says that the easiest thing in the world is to denounce the evildoer. But the most difficult thing in the world is to try to understand
him. Yeah.
And that's what this film aims to do, because I think that like no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, if you're a human rights activist, you want to understand these men and their motivations and who they are as people and on a human level. If you're someone who is fighting the war on terror and these are your enemy, you want to understand, you need to have the right strategies and tactics in order to do that successfully. And
Yep.
if you actually don't understand these men, then you're basing those decisions off of misinformation. And yeah, and I think that like kind of the analogy that I make is, and a lot of experts in this field have kind of voiced this for many years, being that the war on terror, we were fighting against people that we didn't understand, and in doing so, we in many different ways we're making a lot of the wrong choices.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is, like, as I was making this film and getting to know these men on a very deep level, and realizing the disconnect between what I was kind of told who these men were on in mainstream media and what they
Mm-hmm.
actually were when I met them in real life and spent a
Mm-hmm.
lot of time with them, there's a huge disconnect between those two realities. And what I mean by that is, like, as I've been making this film, it's reminded me of a story that my dad told me about starfish.
Mm-hmm.
And he said there was this fishing village in Northern California, and they had a huge problem with invasive starfish. And one day, all the fishermen got together and decided they were going to get rid of this problem once and for all. And they collected all the starfish, cut them up into 3, 4, 5 pieces, thinking they were dead. They threw those pieces back into the ocean, not knowing that starfish regenerate.
Right.
So, like, the moral of the story is, if you try to fix a problem you do not understand, you usually make it worse. So
Mm-hmm.
most experts put the number of Al-Qaeda members around 400 the day after 9/11. Those same experts, right before a little bit before the pandemic, put the number at about 100,000, including affiliate groups. So basically, the
Mm-hmm.
the U.S. has starfished the shit out of the Middle East for the last 2 decades. So
Yes,
yeah, and I
indeed.
think that, yeah, I think one of the things that I think is really great about the U.S. is we're trying to fix things, make things better. But a lot of times we skip the step of actually understanding the thing that we're trying to fix. And
Mm-hmm.
usually, in doing so, in skipping that step, which is quite vital, make mistakes, and some pretty catastrophic mistakes. So yeah.
Yeah. If your objective was to offer a better understanding or an understanding at all of these men as people, as individuals, then the film is wildly successful. I think, because
Yeah.
I don't think you can have a better hour and a half portrait of 4 people, or 5 people, whatever it is. But I mean, it's just, you really are looking at these guys, and one of the things that's remarkable about it is that all of them come across as gentle, meek, even quite sweet. I would say they're a bunch of sweethearts. Like, I would hang out with these guys at a soccer game. I mean, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
I
Well,
don't know.
I think that spending a lot of time with these men, unless you're a complete psychopath, when you spend 3 years with someone pretty consistently, you're going to be emotionally invested in their well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think a lot of reporters try to say, fly on the wall. And if you're only going somewhere for like 2 weeks to do a story, I get that you don't have that emotional connection. But when you spend
Mm-hmm.
3 years with someone, yeah. And I think that, like, what's really interesting is, because we did a tour of the US, we did US tour of the film, and I had so many people come up to me after the film and said, well, 2 things. We always get the same question. It was always the first question we got was like, yeah, after watching the movie, I don't understand what the controversy is about. That was the first question.
Right.
And then the second question was, or it was like more of a statement, but like, oh my gosh, they are so human. Muhammad reminds me of my cousin, or Ali reminds me of my brother. And there was a lot of
Mm-hmm.
connections there between the audience, and seeing that, like, I think what we do a lot of the times, and I think that this kind of stems from a need to feel, I don't want to say above it all, but when you were growing up, or when I was growing up, my family used to read me bedtime stories, right? And
Mm-hmm.
they were children's bedtime stories. So you had the good witch and the bad witch, and the good witch was good because she was born that way, and the bad witch was bad because, same thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we grow up, a lot of us, or at least maybe I'm talking for myself, we don't ever really kind of grow out of that kind of, like, you're good or I'm good, you're
Mm.
bad, and
Yeah.
us versus them thing.
Yeah.
And I think if you ever, the great thing about being a documentarian is you get to sit down and talk to a lot of people face to face that probably most people don't ever have an opportunity to. And so
Mm-hmm.
I've interviewed terrorists, I've interviewed Somali pirates, I've interviewed warlords in Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
And with there's always, the exception to the rule, but most of the people that I've interviewed that I think that would fall under Dostoevsky's definition of evildoer, have been extremely normal. And And what I mean by that is, you know, we're kind of taught this thing of these are the worst, they're bloodthirsty psychopaths, they just want
Mm-hmm.
death and destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And then you sit down with them and you kind of hear their story. And what I mean by that is, I think until I was 22, I kind of held that worldview of like good and bad, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Us versus them.
Yeah.
And then when I was 22, I was kidnapped in Colombia. And while I was kidnapped, 7 people that I had known during that trip were disemboweled and decapitated, which is like the definition of evil. So,
Okay. I didn't know this.
yeah.
Okay. We have more to talk about, apparently. Okay.
But
Jesus.
while I was being held, like being kidnapped is not like the movies. There's not huge explosions and men in like all black going on long diatribes. It's actually quite boring because you don't have any distractions. There's no internet, there's no radio, there's just you and the jungle and other people. And so, you know, you talk to your fellow captives, and after a while, you talk to your captors. And what I remember most about that whole event was not necessarily like the killing and the violence and being, you know, beaten. The thing that was most alarming to me was how normal these people were, and like how logical their life trajectory when you asked them their story was. Like, so for example, one of the people that I talked to was this 17-year-old woman, and her parents had both been killed by the FARC. And so for her, the most logical thing was then to join the rival group, which was the AUC. And I think that, you know, when you're talking about disemboweling and decapitating people in front of their families, you don't get much more evil than that. But just sitting down with her and the other guys that were there and talking to them, and how unnerving it was, how normal they were, and how she was just like any other 17-year-old girl in so many different aspects. She just had like, I think that's when I realized that it wasn't about good and evil. It was about time and circumstance, right? What time and circumstances were you exposed to that, you know, led you down your life's trajectory? And I think that learning that at in my early 20s spiked this curiosity in me to try to understand the world's kind of underbelly / evildoers. And that's why, you know, since then I've interviewed and talked to probably every like arms dealers, warlords, terrorists, you know, pirates. And I think that to me has kind of been my wheelhouse for at least the last 20 years.
Okay. I did not know about your previous career. So we're going to talk about that too. So let's finish telling the story. But before we do that though, so you said you brought up Anne Frank, you know, the Diary of Anne Frank was a great way to understand sort of the human side of the Holocaust story.
Yeah.
The thing is, though, Anne Frank was the victim, and these guys were the bad guys.
The perpetrators, yeah.
Very, very bad guys.
I mean, I think, yeah, I think it's what's interesting about the film is it kind of shows you how there is like, yes, the film starts off with these guys talking about what they did and being perpetrators, and then you hear about what happened to them in Guantanamo, what they went through, and then they become victims. And there's this kind of paradigm shift that happens in the film that goes kind of back and forth, where you might start off the film like being like, oh, these guys are scary and I hate them, and then you're like, oh shit, this is really messed up what happened to him. It kind of goes back and forth. And what I tried to capture is the complexity of that kind of existence, right? So, you know, some of these men did horrible things, and then they went to Guantanamo and had horrible things done to them. And some of the things that were done, and some of the things that were done to them in Guantanamo included like sexual assault and things like that, which I think is completely inexcusable. So yeah, I feel like it's the film is very complex and very nuanced. And I think I had early on when I was going through some edits, I had a lot of people say, it's just, you know, you have to just pick one character. There's too much going on. It's just too complicated. And like, you have to dumb it down for your audience. I'm like, this is the whole point of this film, is to not shy away from the complexity and the contradictions, right? Like you want to be angry at these guys because they were perpetrators, you know? I mean, Khalid was a bomb maker, for God's sake.
Right.
But then you also hear what happened to them in Guantanamo and how that affected them. And then I think it's really interesting because they all kind of land in different spots, and, you know, good, better, best. But I feel like it just shows that as individuals and how we approach the world, it really is dependent on who we are and how we're kind of wired, and whether we're going to be successful, whether we're going to make choice A or choice B. And so I think it really tried to lean into them as individuals versus like, these are all terrorists. It was just these are this Ali, Muhammad, Nader, and Abu Ghanem, and who they were as people, and try to explore that.
So I would imagine that most people listening to this who haven't seen the film or know about the controversy will be shocked to find out that you have been absolutely smashed. The film has been canceled. You've been canceled. And it's been canceled because it is allegedly Islamophobic. And most people,
I prefer the term blacklisted. I feel like
okay, yeah, yes,
because for
yes.
me it's more clear term, because I mean I remember studying the Red Scare and what happened to Hollywood, and just people basically being like accused of something that most of the time was never proven, but just being accused of that kind of puts you on this blacklist where no one would touch you and you couldn't work and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I definitely would agree with the statement that both this film and I have been blacklisted.
Oh yeah,
in the most extreme way.
oh yeah. But again, so it's about allegedly being Islamophobic, which again, if someone had been listening to the first 10 minutes of this, they'd be like, what are you talking about? She's if anything, she's too sympathetic to these guys. She's too busy humanizing these terrorists when we should be judging them and putting them in Guantanamo instead. So, and also I believe, am I right, that your film is the first film to be shown at Sundance and then be disowned by the Sundance producers?
So the film, so originally when I applied to Sundance, I applied to a bunch of other film festivals as well, like TIFF, which is in Toronto, South by Southwest, and it got into all of them. And so it quickly became this film that everyone was really excited about. And as you know, when you go to a film festival like Sundance, you actually send screeners out to film critics before the film actually plays, and they watch it and they write it up beforehand. And then once it plays, they post it online. And so a lot of these film critics, almost all the film critics, saw it before the controversy really blew up.
Okay.
And so universally it was just like glowing praise, like this guy Michael Dunaway from Pace magazine, he said it was an absolute masterpiece. The Guardian said this film is for intelligent people who are looking to have their preconceived notions challenged. Like, we just across the board from all the top critics, it was nothing but just glowing reviews. Which was really interesting, because then the people who wrote those reviews then got emails from the people attacking the film, threatening them with lawsuits, and then some of those reviews got changed. So yeah,
they changed the reviews. Oh my,
yeah,
never heard of that. Wow.
Okay. Yeah, it was, I did not know that happened either. But if you go to if you look at some of the reviews, like on IndieWire and some other ones, if you use like the Wayback Machine, you can see the original one, and then you can see at the very bottom that some of them, but not all of them, some put notes about like, we changed this verbiage and and so yeah. Wow. So it was a very complete blacklisting and a rewriting of history. And I think I wouldn't have been surprised if this had happened maybe in a different industry, but this documentary filmmaking, our whole job is to reserve our judgment until we do our due diligence. And all the people attacking the film started attacking the film before they ever saw it. So I was very surprised that people were willing to publicly state that they hadn't seen the film and then attack it.
Yeah.
Even a jury member at Sundance went on Twitter and said, haven't seen the film. This is during the Sundance Film Festival. This is during the festival. It's not over yet. They're still a jury member. The votes haven't been cast, but they literally went on Twitter and said, haven't seen the film, but there's huge problems with it. Can't believe Sundance would program such a thing. And I'm like, you're a jury member at Sundance. You're openly admitting you haven't seen the film, and then you're denouncing a film you haven't seen. And I remember contacting Sundance and telling them about that. I'd be like, surely there's some, because I've been a jury member before at film festivals. And like, you do not talk about these films publicly that you're viewing or you're judging, or even like, she wasn't in this category, but even like other films as well. And so I thought that was hugely unethical. And I thought like Sundance were kind of like, well, what do you want us to do about it? There's really nothing we can do. And I think that like I think once the tide started to turn, I felt very kind of abandoned by Sundance. So yeah, so Sundance originally programmed the film. They were super excited about it. And we were all ready to go. And then once they made the announcement, so I knew I was in Sundance about 2 months before and the public did. So for those 2 months, it was like everyone was excited about the film. They were really stoked about the premiere. We've got like some of the most, because it was supposed to be in person, we've got some of the best premiere slots, and like the days were just great. And it was really excited about it. And then about 2 weeks before the film was supposed to premiere, Omicron hit and it went virtual. But
Mm,
basically, this film got into all the top festivals.
mm,
Everyone's really excited about it. And then once they made the announcement of what the Sundance lineup was that year, which was about 2 months before the actual film festival itself. The day after the announcement is when the attack started. So that was like almost 2 months before anyone had seen it. So the attack started well before anyone had seen the film. And yeah, and it was kind of this just barrage of letters written to Sundance demanding that they pull the film, and then tweets just attacking the film. And then because we had listed some of the executive producers and the funders on the Sundance website, because you're supposed to put some of the credits of your EPs, and contractually we had to like state the bigger EPs first. So we did that, and then they got reached out to, and one of the investors pulled out before the film ever premiered. And yeah, it was kind of like an onslaught of just attacks and bullying of people for a film that no one had seen. And I think, because I always try to be fair with people, and I
yeah.
always try to like, okay, why would someone do this? Why would someone attack a film that they had never seen?
Mm-hmm.
And then I kind of try to put myself in their shoes and strawman it and basically say like, okay, if I am, because I didn't know who these people were at this time. I do now, but I didn't know at the time.
Mm-hmm.
All I knew is that there were 6 documentary filmmakers who were Muslim, who had kind of campaigned this whole letter writing campaign to or was
Mm-hmm.
organized this letter writing campaign and attack on the film before the premiere. So I was like, okay, why would I attack something I hadn't seen? Okay, well, I'm a Muslim and I've lived in the United States in the last 20 years. Being a Muslim in the United States is very different post 9/11. I know that because a lot of my really close friends and someone who considers my sister is also Muslim. And, we've talked about their experiences and whatnot. And it's just been, a lot harder to be someone who is Muslim in the United States post 9/11 in some areas than it
Mm-hmm.
was pre. And you see shows like Homeland and 24 depicting these stereotypes of Muslims and terrorism, and it's very sensationalistic, very fear mongering narrative
Mm-hmm.
that's been kind of repeated over and over and over again. And so then I'm a filmmaker, and I see that there's a film that's been programmed by Sundance. It's supposed to be this liberal leading film festival that was programmed by this non-Arab, non-Muslim woman, and it's about terrorism. So I think this film's going to be like every other film about terrorism, and it's going to be very fear-mongering, very sensationalistic, very like
Mm-hmm.
harmful. And so I'm not even gonna watch it. I don't need to watch it because I know it, because they're all the same. And so I'm just going to start attacking this film. And I understand that point of view, but the thing is, once you watch the film, it is like the exact opposite of that. And I think that's why this cancellation or this blacklisting has gotten so much, well, now has gotten so much attention. Before, like, no one would talk to me. But I think once the New York Times piece dropped, because I remember reaching out to Michael Powell, and all I did was ask, he was this reporter at the New York Times, like after the film was blacklisted and it was pulled from all the other festivals, we had awards taken away.
Yeah.
It just basically just got wiped off the face of the earth,
Mm-hmm.
except for one film festival in New Zealand. They stuck by it and played it. But
Hmm.
um, I think that I remember messaging him and saying, yeah, I'd really like for you to just watch the film. Just watch it. Because my experience has been, once people watch the film, number one, they're blown away. But number two, they're like, what, this is the thing that everyone's so upset about?
Right.
And so I sent him the film, and he's a Pulitzer Prize winning investigative journalist for the New York Times, who
Mm-hmm.
only writes about like 6 to 8 stories a year. Like, he does deep dives. And
Mm-hmm.
so he's covering stories that are like the AUC and, like really, really big stories that people know of. I am a filmmaker no one's ever heard of, and a film that no one can see. So there's no reason for him to write about this film at all. But what was really interesting is once he did watch the film and then he went online, and he saw what was like written about it, there was such a disconnect between what the film was and how it was being framed by this group. And what I mean by that, like one of the first articles that came out was from a publication called Documentary Magazine, which really went after the film, like really like hard in the paint. And like one of the first paragraphs of that article says, and I quote, "The men profess their innocence throughout the entire film." Now, if you watch the first 3 minutes of the film, you know that's not true.
What?
So this means, like, in the first 3 minutes, Khalid tells you he's a bomb maker for Al
Yeah.
Qaeda. Like, so it was just, I was like, wait, what? This is like supposed to be a reputable publication. And so we write to them, we tell them that, like, hey, like, that's actually wrong. And they didn't correct it. It's to this day, you can Google that article and it's still there. And what was really interesting, it meant one of two things. Either I put in air quotes, the journalist or the writer, either they didn't watch the film but pretended they did, or they watched the film and just lied about it because it didn't fit the agenda that they were pushing at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was a really fast, steep learning curve for me to realize that not everyone operated on the same journalistic standards that I kind of had just thought were custom for everyone, i.e., telling the truth. And if sometimes you do get it wrong, I don't know any journalist who hasn't made a mistake with a date or a name or even a little piece of information, but then once you're made aware, you correct that. But the fact that they written this thing that was just a blatant lie and then refused to correct it, it was just like, you know, I used to be a member of the IDA, which publicizes that, that's their publication. And after that, I was just like, oh my gosh, like what is going on?
What's IDA?
IDA is the International Documentary Association. It's like the big go-to organization for independent documentary films. And they used to be this really amazing organization about, like, you know, truth and freedom of speech and freedom of expression and telling really hard stories that, like, you know, mainstream media wouldn't touch but they've since kind of devolved into this very activist social justice organization that I think for me, I didn't get into storytelling and I didn't get into journalism and documentary filmmaking to save the world. I got into documentary filmmaking to help people understand the world in which we live. Those are two very different things. I think a lot of people, like, I don't look at my films as, you know, trying to save the world and improve it in the image that I want. It's basically just presenting you a story or a time or a people and hopefully broadening your understanding of the world in which you live. And I think that in itself is a hard enough feat as it is.
Yeah, you really have a thing for empathy, don't you? You were just empathizing with the people who got you canceled. You were talking about how understandable it is, in a sense, that they would
not understandable. I think that, like, I think it's imperative anytime you find yourself in a situation where someone is coming after you. I think just as it is imperative to understand, you know, the people who attacked us on 9/11. If someone's going, well, my dad always said there's only 3 types of people in the world, right? Those when you hit them, they hit you right back. Those when you hit them, they run away. And those when you hit them, they ask, why'd you hit me? And I've always kind of been in that third camp. So for me, really. I think it's imperative to, and I think that as Americans, we tend to conflate empathy with sympathy, and those are very two different things. I think there is value in trying to understand someone who's done evil things. That is very different than sympathizing and supporting those views. And I think that I'm definitely a big proponent of trying to empathize with everyone, no matter how vile you think they are. But there is for me, a huge line between empathy and sympathy. And what this film tries to do is it tries to empathize, or it tries to understand these men, but it does not sympathize with them, because in the beginning of the film, we talk about kind of some of the destruction that has been caused by that. But I feel like I wouldn't say like I understand and agree with what they did, but I think that I try to put myself in someone else's shoes that acts so, in my opinion, unethical in terms of lying about things and trying to basically get another filmmaker blacklisted. That's just crazy to me. But so then I'm like, okay, well, why would someone do that? And that's trying to figure that out, because I did offer to speak to these people multiple times. And many people on my crew reached out. The imam that we worked with, he even reached out to them. I remember one time he called me up and he's like, you know, let me reach out to them, Muslim to Muslim. I'm an imam. Like, they'll talk to me. We'll figure this out. We'll, like, you know, we'll we'll have a human, kind of conversation, and we can kind of build something and figure out what's going on, and try to find a solution. And he reached out to them, and then he called me back and he said, I can't believe this, but they even refused to talk to me. He's like, I've never had that happen before, and I'm so sorry. And I just think this is such a ridiculous circumstance that they won't even talk to you or talk to your executive producer, who's also Muslim. It's just, yeah, it was just, yeah, that was another kind of thing that was about the film in terms of the framing of the film versus the film itself, right? So these people had claimed that it was an all-white film team who knew nothing about the Middle East.
Right.
And I'm like, that's actually completely untrue, because my executive producer is Muslim. My co-producer is Muslim. Our assistant editor was Muslim, and we worked with 2 Islamic scholars and an imam. And I lived in the Middle East for, at this point, over a decade.
Wow.
And I originally moved there to learn Arabic and study Islam. So it was a really interesting kind of like judging a book by its cover, right? Like,
yeah.
we see this like 6 foot tall white chick. She probably knows nothing, lives in California, probably knows nothing about the Middle East. And she's just, this dumb girl who fell into this film. And if you know anything about Saudi Arabia, you don't get this kind of access unless you actually like do the groundwork and kind of know what you're doing.
You should not have blonde hair. I mean, I think everything would have gone much better if you didn't have blonde hair.
Yeah, the only dumb blonde's the one with dark roots, though. Gotta tell you that.
Might want to change it. I'm just saying, you'll have a much better career. So the main charge against the film by these people is that, as I said, it traffics in stereotypes about Muslims. I have a hard time even understanding what that would mean, having seen the film. What do they see?
But yeah, but you have to understand, that's what I was trying to tell you, that like they started attacking the film before they had seen it.
No, I know.
So what you also have to the attacks in the film have changed over time.
Okay.
So initially the film was accused of being Saudi propaganda funded by the Saudis. If you actually seen the film, it's like the opposite of that. The Saudi government does not come off looking great by the end of it.
Not at all.
And so it's like, it was kind of like throwing spaghetti at a wall and trying to see what stuck.
Okay.
And so it was just the beginning. It was like, oh, it's funded by the Saudis and it's Saudi propaganda. You're like, no, there's no Saudi money. And also just watch the film and you can see that's not true. And then it was like, oh, it's an all-white film team with no experience in the Middle East. And you're like, nope, just look at our like lineup. And so it's kind of like everything that they would think someone like me would be guilty of. They just accused me of that without actually talking to me or knowing anything about my background or anything about the team that put this together. And I think that's kind of where I was very surprised at, because if you're a journalist, if you're a documentarian, like our whole thing is like, we trying to understand who these people are before we kind of make these judgments. And it was just like, oh, I saw her picture on the Sundance website. Clearly she doesn't know what she's talking about. I don't have to watch the film, and I can just dismiss her and her film and everyone who worked on it from that, which is really interesting, because that's kind of what the film talks about in terms of these men. Like, they're called the worst of the worst. And then we just locked them up and we didn't get to know anything about them whatsoever. And so it's kind of this really strange hypocritical circle that they're like, you look how she's treating these men. It's like, hey, you're kind of treating the people who made the film the same way. So
true.
There you go.
Yeah, it's funny because the problem really is your identity, right? As they perceive it, or your what they would call your positionality. You have a bad position in the society, and you're not supposed to talk about people who are not white, basically.
I think
it's happened to me before.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like
over it.
This is something that is new to me, to be honest, because I've lived in so many different places, and I have in the last couple of years, and this is before Sundance, I'd been made aware that there was the documentary community is quite big, and there's a section of the documentary community who believes that you should not be allowed to tell stories of communities that you're not a part of. Now, that's fine if you want to believe that, but that's not what I believe.
Right.
For a plethora of things. One, I think we would just not tell a lot of stories if we didn't do that. For example, like, my co-producer always says that they could never have made this film because they live in Saudi Arabia and their family lives there, right? And they're listed as anonymous in the credits, and they said it's like, you know, it'd be like me living in North Korea and doing an expose on Kim Jong-un. It would not end well for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just sometimes the safety reasons, you have to have an outsider tell the story. But I also feel like I think there is value in having stories told by many different perspectives. So having an insider and outsider kind of perspective on something, you get a more holistic view.
Of course.
Right. So I think that what was interesting to me to make this film, it was a kind of a unique position to be in, because I used to, before I was a filmmaker, I was a firefighter. And so I was a firefighter on 9/11 in California. And when 9/11 happened, I obviously had a very strong reaction to it, being a firefighter and knowing some people in FDNY.
Mm-hmm.
And that day I saw my country as the victim of terrorism.
Mm-hmm.
And then shortly after 9/11, I moved to the Middle East and moved to Yemen to study Arabic and Islam, because I wanted to understand what had happened. And after living in Yemen for almost 5 years and seeing what my country was doing in the region, and the drone strikes in Yemen, and Yemenis being thrown in mass in Guantanamo, I then saw my country as a perpetrator. So it was really interesting to have one foot in each one of those camps as I was editing this film, and thinking as I was editing this film, like, okay, what would my old firefighter buddies think about this?
Yeah.
What would like the friends and family that I've made in Yemen think about this? And it was really it was hard, but it's also, think, the reason why the film feels so balanced is because of that. I think there's like, at some certain points you're very angry at these guys, and at other points you're like very angry at your own government. It's kind of the same push and pull that I went through as I both made this film, and I tried to represent that as genuinely and authentically as I could in the film itself.
Yeah, I love that about the film. Yeah. It's incredibly nuanced in that way. And in fact, it's very hard to figure out what your politics might be. And I mean, just about the war on terror specifically, it's really hard to figure out what your position is on that. And you and I talked earlier, a couple of weeks ago, about it, but I sort of found out in that talk what your politics were. I really didn't know, but
But I think, that's on purpose. And I also feel like, don't get me wrong, I think that Michael Moore is probably a great person, and he has made a documentary that grossed over $100 million at the box office. And anyone who does that, I'm just like, high five. Let's like up documentary films to get to the same level as fiction films. But his films are very much like, here's my point of view, and here are all the interviews that's going to support this thesis.
Right.
But personally, the way that I'm wired is, if you try to tell me something, if you say you must believe this, my first response is to push away.
Good.
And I'm a bit of a contrarian, I guess, in that aspect. But
yeah, me too.
So I always like it when I'm allowed to make up my own mind. And so it's really great about this film, or one thing that I really like about it, is it's very open-ended. And in making it in a way to where you're not quite sure what the director thinks, or their political stance, it allows you to be able to make up your own mind, because I trust my audience. And we're all adults, and you have enough life experience and enough brain cells to be able to watch an hour-and-a-half film and then make up your own decisions about who these men are and what you think about them. I think that, like, the great thing about doing it that way is that after a lot of these screenings, by not telling people what the film is and what to think, people have internalized it in their own individual ways. And what I mean by that is, we've had a large number from the vet and military community who've had a ridiculously strong reaction to the film in a quite a positive way. And kind of the sentiment there has been, I've had this said to me and emailed to me and messaged to me a couple times, but the kind of, like, for example, a guy who basically said, when I watched your film, it was really hard for me. I had to like process it a couple days before I wrote to you, because there was just so much emotion there. And he said, I would never admit this to anyone, but I miss war. I don't miss the fighting or the shooting. I miss the sense of brotherhood and camaraderie and the sense of purpose.
Right.
And since I've gotten back to the United States, I felt so lost, because I haven't found that here anywhere. And I haven't seen that here. And I hadn't seen that until I watched your film, and I saw these men in your film. And I realized after watching your film that I had way more in common with the men that I was sent to kill than the people who sent me there in the first place, i.e., Congress, millionaires, really
Oh,
read that. And,
yeah.
and so like, and for him, it was really cathartic and very kind of like, he said, when I couldn't have seen this film when I was in active duty because I can't I have to like not think about these men as people, as humans. Like I have a
Yeah.
job to do. It's kind of really hard to do that if you
Mm-hmm.
can, empathize with them. But
Mm-hmm.
now that I'm back from war, this has been really healing for me to be able to process this in a way that I was never able to do up until your film. And then a different reaction we got was really interesting. One of the screenings, somebody came up to me afterwards. It was one of the ones in Glendale. And they said, I was really hesitant to come to your film because I lost family members in the towers in 9/11. I was like, ooh, yeah, this would be a really rough film to watch if you had that experience. And I knew that going in. And she said, and I was very hesitant to come to see this film. She's like, but honestly, when I heard one of those men saying that when they saw the trade towers on the TV and they saw the people jumping from the building, that they realized that what they did was wrong. She's like, I never realized how much I needed someone from the other side just to say that this was wrong. And she's like, it was so cathartic to hear at least one person say that they had that this was a mistake and they shouldn't have done this.
Yeah.
And then we had people who were illegal immigrants in the United States to watch the film, and they really identified with these guys after they get out, being like kind of a stateless state, like they're there, but they can't work, but and then kind of being this limbo. And so leaving the film so open-ended like that, you had different kind of groups of people interpret the film and internalize it in this much more personal way than I think if I said, okay, this is what the film's about, and this is where you're going to end the film, and this is how you're going to think about it. I just think it's such a beautiful thing to be able to have people take what is in the film and kind of internalize it in such a personal way. But also I think that also leaves you open to attack, because you can watch the film and if you're looking for bad things, you'll find those bad things.
Yeah.
And confirmation bias is real. So yeah.
Sure is. Okay. I want to talk about you now. You've said some very interesting things about your background, and I'm just very curious about them. So you were a firefighter, and you were kidnapped in Colombia. Which was first?
Firefighter. I was a firefighter from age 18. So 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 6 years. And then I moved to Yemen and I taught firefighting. I was a head instructor at a firefighter academy there. And I did that for a couple of years. And that's actually where I first heard about the rehab center. I was on the fire grounds doing a live fire drill with some of my cadets. And I overheard a conversation, and I think the year was like 2007, around there. And they were talking about a terrorist attack that had happened in Saudi Arabia. And according to them, the perpetrators had been caught, and half the perpetrators were Saudi and the other half were Yemeni. And the Yemenis, they said, were tortured and killed, but the Saudis were sent to something that they referred to as Jihad Rehab. And at the time, I wasn't a documentarian, I wasn't a journalist, but it always struck me as kind of strange. Like, why is the most conservative country in the world running some progressive rehab program for terrorists? It just was like, what? So that always stuck with me. And then later on in life, when I changed careers, it was a story that I was still really wanted to explore and know more about. And and so that's why I wind up doing the film.
When was Colombia though? Because I thought you went straight from firefighting to Yemen.
So Colombia was during firefighting. So
Okay.
I took some time off from work and did a little bit of traveling. Well, I took time off from work every year because in California, we have there's seasonal firefighting, right? And so I worked full time, but there's a portion of the year that's less busy, or it used to be. Now it's year round. And so I'd always like take time off and travel. And so I went down and I traveled in Nicaragua, Costa Rica, Panama, and Colombia, and got kidnapped in Colombia.
Oh, so you weren't doing like a filmmaking or political work on
No,
Colombia?
this was just
on bad luck.
yeah, this is just on my off time from fighting fires. I would go down and
On a vacation, you got
on a
kidnapped.
vacation. Yeah.
Well, what the fuck? Wait, what were you doing? Why were you kidnapped by? Was this FARC or was this another?
The AUC, which is the opposite of the FARC. So the FARC's like Marxist. So let's say you're a landowner and you own 1,000 hectares. If you're the FARC, you want to take that land and give 1 hectare to each person. But if you're the AUC, is kind of the opposite side.
So why did they take
Go
you? Why did they kidnap you?
I mean, at that time, so this is back in 2000, late 2002, early 2003, I think it was. So I was, do you know what the Darien Gap is?
Yes,
Okay, so
I
like the
do.
Darien Gap, for people who don't know, is like the Bermuda Triangle, but on land. Like people
Yeah,
go there and then they're never heard from again, and no one
right,
knows what happened to them.
right.
I really like puzzles. I really like to, one of the reasons I got into this in documentary filmmaking is I like to understand things, especially complicated things that seem a bit just chaotic. And so the Darien Gap for me was a point of interest because it was this place that was so notorious, but so little was known about it. And I think when
Hmm.
I did research, the last person that went there successfully came back was like 1987, so it was quite a while before. And so I was really curious about this. And so yeah, I went from Panama overland through the Darien Gap, which is like this 250,000, or it's a 250 mile wide stretch of virgin jungle
Right.
that straddles the border between Panama and Colombia. And when I say virgin jungle, it takes you like 20 minutes to go from like here to that wall over there, because it's
I
just
know.
like so thick and you're hacking away with a machete.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so I went down there because I was very curious about this, place of notoriety, but very few people had heard about it. And I was there with two other people, and we'd met some local Kuna Indians along the way who helped navigate us through the jungles, because our GPS didn't work down there because the canopy's so thick. That's how thick it, like we couldn't even like use our GPS to know where we were, where
Oh,
we're going.
wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, but long story short, during that trek across the border, when I entered into Colombia, we were taken by a group called the AUC, and for a little bit less than 2 weeks,
But
and then
why?
they released us. Well, I think it was like I think for them, you have to ask them that, but I think at that particular time, the post 9/11, it was very uncool to be labeled as a terrorist group, for lack of a better word.
Hmm.
And so a lot of groups like the FARC were in negotiations to be legitimized and be seen as a legitimate political party. And they were in talks with the Colombian government at that time, and the AUC wanted a seat at the table. And I think one of the reasons, I don't know this because I don't know what happened behind closed doors, but I think one of the reasons we were released is kind of, we were used as a political football to be like, hey, see, we're releasing these people. We're a legitimate party too, and can we have a seat at the table, kind of thing. But yeah.
But they killed people that you knew?
Yeah, so during the kind of trek through the jungle, we had stopped off at different villages and met the village elders, and we explained to them what we were doing there, and then they would send like their sons to kind of help us through the jungle.
Hmm.
And when we were caught, they took one of those guys and took him back to the village, and then they robbed and burned the village to the ground and disemboweled him and a couple other people that we'd known from the village and from their families as a message. So basically, the AUC hunt the FARC, and they hunt FARC sympathizers, and they believe that this village was FARC sympathizers, and so they wanted to send a message to them not to do that. So that's what they chose to do.
Meg, so I'm getting the sense that you have a penchant for going into dangerous places.
I mean, I was a firefighter after all.
Firefighting, Darien Gap, and then Yemen.
Mm.
um, what is this about you? I mean, these are like arguably
What
the
a
most.
strange question. What's up with this?
What's wrong with you? These are like the most dangerous places a person can go. Burning buildings and the Darien Gap and Yemen.
I mean, yes and no. How to put this? So it is and it isn't. So what I mean by that is, if you ran into a burning building, you'd probably die because you know what the fuck you're doing. You have no safety gear. You have no training.
Right.
You die.
Right.
But being trained and having the right gear, it's actually you mitigate that risk quite substantially. And what I mean by that is, imagine that you knew absolutely nothing about the United States. You didn't know who the president was. You couldn't find it on a map. The only thing you knew about the United States is what you read in the New York Times about the rapes and the muggings and the killings and the school shootings. And you would just think America was like Mad Max on crack, and it's like the most
Right.
dangerous place in the world. Like, oh my God. I remember being in a
Right.
cab in Saudi Arabia, and this guy asked me where I was from in Arabic, and I told him I was from America. He's like, oh, you must be so, it's just so dangerous there. All your school shootings, you must be so worried for your children. I'm like, I don't have kids, but yes, it is a thing. And so it's really interesting because I feel like I lived in Yemen for almost half a decade.
Wow.
And my family was really worried the whole time I was living there. And then one time I flew my parents over. I'm like, okay, just come visit. Let me just show you what it's like. Because how Yemen was being portrayed on the news was so different than my actual lived experience there. And I think that, no, I've been to Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. Like I've been to, I would say, like, if to throw back to the early 2000s, I've been to almost the entire axis of evil, if you want to put it that way.
Yeah. Now you were just in Bakhmut, right? You're probably like
and what I can say is that the way that these places are framed in the media, and it's very similar to how my film was framed in the media, is very different than what they're actually like.
Yeah.
And so for you to say it's dangerous, I mean, I think that when you go to Yemen and you've never been there before, it's a bit different than if you speak the language, the culture, and you're able to communicate with people in their mother tongue. I think that Somalia, so for example, I would say going to Mogadishu for most people at the time that I went, it would be very dangerous. However, I did it in a way that utilized certain things to mitigate that risk, if that makes sense. So
sure.
Yeah, it's just, it would be very dangerous for me to go to a place like North Korea if I didn't know anything, speak the language, or have any contacts there. But would I go to Yemen tomorrow? Of course. Yes. I know enough people there, and I feel like that is a different situation, because you're, like I said, like there's running into a burning building as a layperson, and there's running into a burning building as a firefighter.
Well, I guess I'm getting at the why on this project. You said you moved to Yemen when you were a firefighter after 9/11 just to understand what was happening in the world. But I mean, you chose Yemen, first of all. Why Yemen? And that's a huge, giant rupture in your life. You were a firefighter in California, and then all of a sudden you're a journalist in the middle of the war on terror in the Middle East.
Well, I wasn't a journalist originally. I was still teaching firefighting. So I ran a firefighting academy in Yemen. Yeah. So
okay.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
Sorry, what was the question?
No, just why? What the hell's wrong with you? That's the question. Same question.
What the hell is wrong with you? Interesting way to put it. I think that I was very lucky to, at a very, very young age, when you're in your late teens, early 20s, you feel like you're invincible and you're gonna live forever. And you have this very self-assured view of the world. And when I was 18, 19, 20, those years where you're supposed to just be, I know I'm so self-assured and so invincible. I was going on calls where I was, picking up body parts and seeing people just die in front of me. And it made me very aware of my own impermanence and how fragile life was. And how, you don't really get to dictate. I'm sorry, my dog. You don't really get to dictate how and when you go out. The only thing you have any control over is like kind of what you do while you're here. And I think because that happened to me at such a young age, it instilled this sense of urgency to do all the things that I wanted to do, that I was curious about now. Because I remember going on this call once where it was really, really early in the morning. I think it was before the sun came up, and this semi had jackknifed a car, and the guy on the passenger side, or the driver's side, not a scratch on him, the guy on the passenger side was decapitated, and only 6 inches separated them, those two men. And it was a pretty bad call. We airlifted the guy who survived, and then, as was protocol back then, you have to wait on scene until the coroner shows up to deal with the body. And so we were kind of stuck there until the coroner showed up, and it was really, really early in the morning, so it was going to be a while, and it started raining, and the rest of my crew kind of jumped in the cab. And at the time, my captain had this habit of, after call, he'd light up a Swisher Sweet and smoke it, and then we'd go back to the firehouse. But because he was raining, he would smoke it in the cab, and I just don't like the smell of cigars and it just sticks on you. So my choice was either to stand in the rain, go in the cab and just inhale cigar smoke, or to sit by the decapitated body in the car that was now in the vacant to be sheltered from the rain. So that's what I chose to do. And as I sat by this guy, no head, I waited for a very long time. The longer I sat there, the more I really wanted to know who he was. He was dressed in this uniform, so he was clearly going to work and working a 9 to 5. And I looked and found that he had a wallet and they had a picture of family, and then an outdated kind of mini, like back when you had wallets and people kind of put pictures of them and stuff, like not in your phone. And he had this like little folded up magazine ad in his wallet that I unfolded and looked at it, and it was a picture of Ayers Rock, or Uluru, which is this big rock in Australia, and it said, "Come climb Ayers Rock before it's too late." And I guess they were talking about like making it sacred space so you could no longer climb on it. And I thought, here's this guy who was working this 9 to 5 and probably had this ad in his wallet for when he retires, he's going to finally go see this rock and finally go have this adventure. And he just never got to do that. And he never got the opportunity to. And instead of wait to do those things, just do them now. And so that kind of instilled this sense of urgency in me. And when 9/11 happened, that instilled this sense of like almost unquenchable curiosity about the world. And so right after 9/11 happened, about a little bit over 6 months, I traveled to Afghanistan to try to find those answers for myself. Because that day generated a lot of questions for me, questions that weren't being answered on mainstream media. So I traveled to Afghanistan a little bit over 6 months after 9/11 and to try to find those answers, and was immediately humbled by my own ignorance of the world. I mean, when you're in your early 20s, you have a very self-assured view of the world. And I think going to Afghanistan and actually being on the ground there kind of shattered all that. And then once I realized that, I kind of made it my mission to kind of educate myself about the world in which I lived. And I realized that for me, the way to do that was firsthand. And the reason why is after 9/11, we talked before about, when someone hits you, you respond 3 ways. And the third way, why did you hit me? And so right after 9/11, I started reading all these books about Islam and the history of the Middle East, and watching the news ferociously. And I saw a huge disconnect between what I was reading about and what I was seeing on TV. And they most of the time directly contradicted each other. So I'd read about how in Islam it's wrong to kill an innocent person, and then on the news I'd hear this is a violent religion and it's just XYZ. And I didn't really know which one to believe or which one was right. And then after a while I realized both what I was reading and what I was watching in the news was information that was being given to me through someone else's filter, right? And the only way for me to truly understand would be to remove that filter and just see firsthand myself. And so that's what I did. And it wasn't very popular at the firehouse when I told the guys I was going to be going to Afghanistan. But eventually they were supportive. But I think that, so you asked, why do you do this? And I think it's, for me, it's a combination of a sense of urgency that was instilled in me in quite a young age, and the realization that there is no such thing as a safe life, in terms of like, you can die on your way to work, you can die in Afghanistan, but we are going to die someday. And I choose to live a life of curiosity. And one of those things is, being curious about the world. It means you have to see the world in order to answer those questions. And I think that with kind of the amalgamation of that with being kidnapped at such a young age and being face to face with, in quotes, that the evildoers of the world, kind of planted this seed of really wanting to understand the underbelly and really wanting to understand the world in which I live in a more holistic way. And that doesn't mean that's not just understanding the victims of something. It's also understanding the perpetrators of that. And what I mean by that is, in the documentary field, a lot of the funding comes from organizations and grants. And those organizations are, have donors, and they all want to make the world a better place. And so a lot of the documentaries that get funded and made are documentaries about victims or the environment. And what happens is you have this slew, pretend the world is a coin. And on one side of the coin, you have all these stories about the victims of different atrocities and things like that,
Mm-hmm.
because they get funded. But on the other side, you have the perpetrators, and you can't understand the world in which you live unless you understand both sides. And for me, I'm much more interested in the other side of the coin, because that's one that hasn't been explored that much. I can literally list you like less than a 10, like maybe 5 documentaries that have been done in the last 10 years about the perpetrators. Like
Mm-hmm.
there's active
Yeah.
killing, there's of fathers and sons. I mean, there's just less than a handful of them. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that if you want to truly understand the world in which you live, you need to explore both sides of those coins. And I feel like, because of my background and because of just the way that I'm wired and a certain skill set that I have, it's for me, I tend to fall on the other side of the coin, where I think that's the place where I was like well suited to tell those stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
So after 9/11, you went to Yemen, you said, to understand 9/11 because you felt like the mainstream media was not helping you understand it. So I want to
Not
ask you
just to
this.
understand
What?
9/11, but it was just basically like, there was so much going on between what I was seeing in the media and then what I was reading in books and academic articles, and
Yeah.
there was such a disconnect between the two. There was like, okay, I need to figure out what the fuck this is all about, because
Yeah.
there's no
Well,
these are completely opposite.
so what, that's the question. What the fuck is it all about? What do you now think 22 years later, and having lived there for many years, having done this film, having known intimately many of these people who were involved in Al Qaeda, what do you make of 9/11 and the war on terror?
Well, let me ask you this question.
Okay.
You have seen the film
Yeah.
multiple times now, right?
Hmm. Twice.
How has it, before you saw the film versus after you saw the film, has your opinion or your views of the war on terror changed at all?
No. But my position on the war on terror is that the United States should withdraw entirely from the Middle East tomorrow and have nothing to do with it
Let me for that.
militarily. Yeah.
Has your view, sorry, has your view or understanding, sorry, maybe not the war on terror, I should have said, of these men changed at all?
Oh, yeah. Oh, and that's why I said it's wildly successful in what it's doing, the film, because I've never seen any real portrait of any of those guys. Yeah, as I said, they were. I'm reminded of Hannah Arendt's The Banality of Evil. You know, she when she talked about the Nazis and Eichmann being sort of during the Nuremberg trials, being sort of
Yeah.
surprised at how these were just like ordinary dudes.
Yeah.
The Nazis were just like ordinary dudes and boring, banal, right? In a way.
Yeah.
And that's what these guys are. I mean, they're just ordinary dudes who I said I would totally go to a soccer game with and hang out with and smoke shisha with, right? Kind of want to do that actually. I was watching them smoke with the hookahs and I was like, that looks good. Um, you know, it's hard to believe at times that these guys were ever jihadis because they don't seem political. Um,
So that's the thing,
yeah,
I think, in terms of understanding, right? So the whole starfish analogy,
yeah.
right? So if you believe that all of these men are ideological motivated, and you make
Hmm.
your decisions about finding the war and terror based on that information,
Yeah.
you're making a huge assumption that is not actually correct.
Okay.
So what I mean by that is, I interviewed over 150 of these men during the
Mm,
course of making this film.
mm, mm,
Of
mm,
that 150, I mean, the interviews lasted anything from like 10 minutes to 10 hours.
mm-hmm.
Khalid's interview, the guy who opens the film, it was 10 hours long.
Wow.
And after interviewing, so about over 150, between 150 to 200, I talked to, and then of that 150, around only 30 were interested in the project, and of that 30, 12 were interested in doing the project without their faces being blurred as from a sign of disguise. So we wound up recording or interviewing on and being recorded like 12 different guys. But
Mm-hmm.
one of the things I'm really grateful for having the opportunity to talk to so many of them before we started actually like picking the characters was, when I was interviewing that many of them, I began to see a pattern, right? And they, not all of them, because there's always exceptions, but most of them would fall of one of 4 categories. in terms of their motivation about why they got into it. I mean, universally, all of them were kind of like pretty young and looking for a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, but they would fall into one of four categories in terms of why they joined these groups. And so the one that there's four of them, the one that most of us are familiar with is the cause, right? This is your religious duty to do this. And that's Abu Ghanem. You saw him, and he saw Muslims being slaughtered in Bosnia, and he felt it his religious duty to go there and defend them and to join the fight. But the other three have absolutely nothing to do with religion at all. And I think that's the thing that we are not talking about. So those three are economic necessity. That's the second motivation. That's Nader. You know, it's some he says in the film, you know, I didn't have a job. I needed a job. This basically became a career for him for over a decade. The third motivation is peer pressure, and that was Ali. His brother was in this. It's his, you know, kind of a family business, and he kind of fell into it as well and was pressured into going to Afghanistan by his older brother. And the last one, and this is more age dependent, more the younger guys, sense of adventure, and that's Muhammad in the film. He says, you know, I was 19, I was bored, I didn't want to go to school, I didn't want to work. This guy offered me a free ticket to go shoot rockets in Afghanistan. You know, I was 19, I'm like, why not? And what's really interesting is I have a lot of friends that are in the military, in the US military. And I was listening to these guys talk about the motivations about why they joined, you know, Al Qaeda and all the other groups. I saw a lot of similarities in terms of the motivation. So, for example, so we have the cause, economic necessity, peer pressure, sense of adventure. Let's take the cause. I have loads of friends who joined the military right after 9/11.
Yeah, me too.
Cause, right? I come from working class. My dad's a firefighter. Like most people in my family are like either firefighters or cops or teachers or so don't come from a lot of money. And so school is very expensive in this country. And so I have a lot of friends who, in order to afford that, they went into the military to help pay for school. That's economic necessity. You know, and the third one, peer pressure. I have a lot of friends who come from military families. Their uncles, their fathers, their brothers are all in the military. That's motivation number 3. It's kind of like what the family does. The last one, if you look at any of the ads for the military, it's like, you know, come have an adventure, see the world. That's motivation number 4, sense of adventure. And what I realized after a long period of time of interviewing these men is it was never about good and evil. It's about time and circumstance, right? And so maybe if they were born in the US, maybe they would have joined the US military. So I think that, like, in terms of, you know, what did I learn? I learned that, and you know, this is one of the reasons why I like the film so much, is because early on someone said, just focus on one character because, you know, it's just too many characters to keep track of. And this is earlier edits. And I was just like, yeah, but then you're basically going to watch the film. And if you're only focusing on Ali, then you think, oh, they're all motivated by X or they're motivated by Y. And it was imperative to me to show the complexity of these men and what motivates them and the different reasons about why they get into this. And not just that, you had different reasons of why they got into this, but the different levels of culpability, right? You have someone like Khalid, who was, you know, the lead bomb maker and bomb instructor for Al-Qaeda. And you have someone like Ali, whose older brother was an instructor at Al-Farouk training camp, which is Al-Qaeda training camp. And at age 16, his brother contacted him back in Yemen and basically said, hey, you need to come out here and you need to do at least just come out here and just do the training camp for a bit. And then if you don't like it, you can go back to Yemen. And in the Middle East, it's not like here where we just like rebel against our family members. If your older brother or your father tells you to do something, part of that culture is you do it because, you know, that's a form of respect, and it's more family oriented than we are here. So he did. He went out to Afghanistan from Yemen at age 16. He went to the training camp, was there for a couple of weeks, and then 9/11 happened, and then he got picked up and sent to Guantanamo, where his brother escaped and rose up the ranks and then became the leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula in Yemen. And, you know, so you have someone who just went to a training camp for a couple of weeks and then you have someone like Khalid, who was a bomb maker for Al-Qaeda. So it also shows a different level of culpability, because when we use the term terrorist, we have this image in our mind, but it's very, it's so much more complex than that, because for example, someone like Harvey Weinstein is a sex offender. But you're also labeled a sex offender if you're 18, you sleep with a 16-year-old.
Correct.
So one of the goals of this film is to show the kind of like, hey, like there is a spectrum here that we need to acknowledge.
Yes.
And I think that a lot of people, when they hear terrorists or when they hear sex offender, they just go to like the extreme when there is so much in between. Like you have, I mean, if you would kind of like mild, medium, and spicy
Mm-hmm.
terrorists, you have someone like,
Mm-hmm.
Khalid, who's a bomb maker, and then someone like Ali, who just went to a training camp. And then you have somewhere in the middle is Muhammad, where he was there, he was doing it for a little bit, but he didn't really go outside of Afghanistan or like attack people in like the western part of the world and stuff like that. So it
Yeah.
was casting the film, it was, or like selecting the subject of the film, it was imperative for me to show that variety and that complexity and that nuance, and then to not shy away from it.
Right.
Because I think that like some people watch the movie and they're like, yeah, clearly like Khalid was a terrorist, but I don't know if I think Ali was a terrorist. And I'm like, well, that's a discussion that that's kind of the point of the film. And like, who is a terrorist? Why did they do this? Is this
Right.
really? So it just asks a lot of really complicated questions. And to your point, you said, what was your takeaway? What did you learn?
Yeah.
And my response is like, well, I learned a lot, but there are still so many questions that I'm sure that both the film leaves you with and that I'm still left with. And I
Yeah.
think that that's the great thing about the world, is like, you can't, I feel like I never got to a point where I'm like, I know it all now, so I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah. No, excellent. I love that. And Americans, you're right. We generally we are binary thinkers, and it's one of the worst things about American culture. We see things as black or white. You're either a terrorist or you're not a terrorist, right?
Yeah.
You're either a sex offender or you're not a sex offender. So, great. So now you are blacklisted. The film is blacklisted. You're having trouble getting work. Is that right?
Yeah, so literally yesterday, this is my new place. I lived in the Bay Area for over 10 years. I loved it there. I was
Yeah.
born in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
Um, and after Sundance, because of what happened and being blacklisted, I couldn't get work anymore. And the Bay Area is probably the most expensive place to live in the
Yep.
United States.
Yep.
And I tried to turn it around, and I tried to get work, and it just wasn't happening, because initially I would go, even when I went to go get work outside the documentary world, I would apply for a job and they would Google my name, and then racist Islamophobe would come
Oh
up. This is
no.
before the New York Times piece came out.
Oh God.
So
Jesus.
yeah,
Fuck.
and so I basically got to the point where I was just getting more and more in debt, and so I decided to well, I didn't decide. I kind of had to move because I've got myself in quite a financial destitute situation.
Mm,
So for me, it's
mm.
kind of moving out from the Bay Area to a place that is a lot cheaper, so I can save money and pay off some of the debt that I've racked up over this last year. But yeah,
But what about your career? What are you gonna do about it?
I'm still figuring that out. I
Yeah.
think that I've realized that there's no chance of anyone's going to give me money for a documentary film anytime soon, at
Really?
least in the United States.
Really?
I talked
I
to
don't,
some people when we were on tour overseas that were really, really keen on the film, and said, "Hey, reach out if you ever do another documentary. I'd love to help." But I think that like the community. So how do I put this? When the film came out and there was attacks in the film, the narrative around the film was that I was a white supremacist and that the film was Islamophobic and XYZ. And that was the only story that was out there. And I think right after Sundance, I tried to like talk to people and get people to write about the film and actually write what was in the film. And everyone kind of said the same thing. We can't write about a film that no one can watch. I remember reaching out to someone who was Muslim and a film critic, and he's like, "I love this film," and I pitched it to my to write about it for my editor, and he basically said, like, you can't write about a film that no one can see. That doesn't make sense. And so for 9 months, basically, I tried to get someone to write about it, and during that time I was also trying to get work. But again, it's like, if I Googled your name and the first 5 things that came up said that Thaddeus was like a racist white supremacist, are you really going to get hired by that company? No. So
yeah.
I think what people don't realize about being blacklisted is, when you do something wrong, there is a punishment with a time limit. Like, you steal a car, you go to prison for a couple of years and then you get out. But when you're blacklisted, and even if you have done something really minor or done nothing at all, it's kind of a life sentence, because for the rest of your life, when people look you up online, that will be next to your name. So I was one of the fortunate ones, because for 9 months, I kind of just struggled to get anyone to write about the film in an honest way. because I think what I realized quite quickly after Sundance is that my understanding about what it meant to be a journalist was very different than where journalism is today. I think a lot of big places, big publications are less worried about finding the truth in a story and more worried about fitting a narrative that's already been assigned.
Yep.
And I remember having a conversation with someone in the trades at one of the publications that wrote about the film early on, and I was like, I wasn't yelling at him on the phone. I'm like, this is not true. This is completely false. And he was just like, well, why would everyone say that then? I'm like, but I can show you that it's not true. Like I literally have paperwork to show this. And he didn't want to see it, and he didn't want to talk about it. And then he just printed the film or printed the article the next day. And it was just, I was kind of blown away by that. And then I remember there was a friend of mine who I'd known for years, who used to be a film critic. And I had sent him my film a couple months before Sundance. And I said, hey, I want you to rip this apart. I want to know now where all like the, holes are that need to be patched. So I don't want to hear any of this shit after the premiere. Like, if you're going to rip it apart, do it now.
Right.
And so I sent him a cut that I wasn't done editing yet, but I was pretty close. And he wrote me back and he said, I can't believe this is your first feature length film. Two, it's because extraordinary. And two, I have like 2 small notes, but be prepared for your whole life to change, because this is going to be the it film of the year. This is going to be like the biggest film at the festival. And then a couple months after Sundance, he reached out and he said, so are you counting your millions from your huge sale and, swatting away all your job opportunities? And I was like, oh, clearly you haven't been following this story. And I told him what happened. And he was absolutely appalled, because he'd seen the film and he knew me quite well at that point. And he's just like, wait a minute, this film, and of all the people, you? And he said, you got to find a journalist to write about this. And I was like, I've been reaching out to people and like, at IndieWire, and he was just like, no, not the trades aren't real. You need a real journalist with like, like a real investigative journalist. And I was like, well, I don't really know any of those. And so he's like, I know a couple of them, but there's one guy I think would actually do his due diligence on this. And so he introduced me via email to Michael Powell. And then I, sent the film to Michael Powell, and eventually he watched it. And then when he said that he was interested in interviewing me, then I kind of freaked out. I really almost pulled out of the interview, because at that particular time, within the small fishbowl that is the documentary community, I was radioactive. I was persona non grata. But outside that fishbowl, no one knew who the fuck I was. And I thought, like, if this interview goes bad and this is a really bad article, then the whole world is going to know who I am. And I'm going to be blacklisted everywhere. And I was so scared. But then I thought of Monica Lewinsky, of all people.
Yeah.
And I remember being a senior in high school and listening to her story on the news. And people were talking about her. And the narrative at the time was she was this dumb bimbo who seduced the president. And I believed that hook, line, and sinker, because that's all that was in the press. And I thought that was the facts. And then I think it was 15, 20 years later, I saw her do a TED Talk. And far from being this dumb bimbo, she was this very witty, introspective, intelligent, articulate woman who had been so mischaracterized by the media. And that kind of made me realize that as long as I allow like this narrative out there, everyone's going to believe that I am a white supremacist, that I am this Islamophobic, horrible person. And that I might not be able to make that narrative go away, but at least I'll be able to tell somebody the truth of what happened. And so I finally agreed to do the interview, and he flew out to California, and I think we spoke for over 18 hours, over a couple of days. And then he went away for months and just did a huge deep dive and contacted all these people who were involved in the Cancellation and Sundance and Abigail Disney and all other stuff. And I didn't know what the article was going to say. And I was really scared, because I'm an extremely private person. And having your story on your face on the front page of the New York Times is really kind of the opposite of what a private person wants to
Yeah.
do.
Mm-hmm.
But the alternative was that I was going to have other people write my story for me about who I was as a person and what my film was. And they were just lying about both of those things. I want to say that they were like, they misunderstood it, but they literally were lying about stuff that they
Yeah.
knew
Right.
was not true.
Clearly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that came out. And then at the time, I had also been reaching out to other uh, journalists to try to get them to write about the story. And then the Graham Wood, who has been to Saudi Arabia and has been to the rehab center and actually interviewed MBS. So he's like an expert in this field. He even wrote a book on terrorism. He knows this inside and out. And he watched the film and really liked it and then saw it was written about it. And he attacked a different side of the kind of controversy because he had different expertise than Michael Pell did. And then Sebastian Junger, who's one of my favorite kind of journalists and writers of all time, he saw the film and was basically like, he's like, you made Restrepo, but for the other side of the wire, basically.
Right.
And he wrote about it as well. And I think that was all. I thought after all that, after kind of being vindicated at the front page of the biggest publication in the world and the Atlantic and Sebastian Junger, I thought that after that you'd have distributors that would be like, okay, like clearly, like this film was misrepresented. Let's give this film another chance. Let's pick it up. I mean, it was the most talked about film in the world that no one could watch.
Right.
And so there was no distribution. There was, I mean, it basically just sat on my hard drive. And then I was invited to go on the Sam Harris podcast. And I didn't know a lot about Sam Harris. I listened to a couple of episodes, but I didn't know him very intimately or anything. And I was, again, what I did know, I thought like, oh, he's really not going to like this film, because I'd seen the clip with him and Ben Affleck on the Bill Maher show. And I'm like, oh, he's definitely not going to like this film. But I also, what was clear to me is listening to some of his podcasts and some of the interviews is, even though I believe that he was not going to like the film, I also knew from listening to him talk that he was someone that could have a intellectual, rational conversation where you can discuss and debate maybe our differing views in a way that could be very interesting and constructive.
Right.
And so that is kind of why I was like, oh, this might be a very interesting talk. And then I had a bunch of friends say, don't go on Sam Harris. You're already labeled as Islamophobe. Like, you're going to get even more blacklisted. And then when I talked to Sam, it was such a great like discussion, because he had seen the film and he came to it with an open mind. It was clear, because he at one point in the interview said, this is the perfect rejoinder for someone like me. Like, this film made me question some of my beliefs. And that's someone who held those beliefs quite strongly. But one thing I like about Sam is he has strong beliefs loosely held, meaning if you can prove him wrong, or if you can have a different perspective that he hasn't considered yet, he will consider that. And I think in today's world where people plant their flag in a camp and they're so reluctant to pick it up, even when they've been proved wrong, it's a rarity to have someone like that who is willing to change their ideas and their opinions when they're presented with different information or a different perspective, which you think would be kind of common sense for everyone. But so we had a conversation, and that was the first time since Sundance that I had talked about the film publicly without a filter, meaning I never had given an interview on TV or a podcast. It was just maybe a quote here, a quote there in the New York Times, but no one had actually heard my voice.
Yeah.
And so just like Monica Lewinsky giving a TED talk in her own voice, it was talking to Sam about the film and who I was and why I made it. And I think that I will forever be grateful for his generosity, because again, I'm a nobody. He has world scholars and famous people and politicians on his show, and I'm a nobody compared to them. So I'm very thankful and grateful that he was able to give me that platform and that space to tell my side of the story. And he was also very generous, because he put that one episode up without a paywall, because normally his podcast is paywalled, and so people listened to it and they shared it to people who'd maybe never heard Sam Harris before, and that got shared and kind of went viral.
Yeah.
And right after the New York Times piece dropped, two things happened to me that were really both interesting and alarming. One was I had up until that point, up until that story was published, I had only heard about people being canceled who were famous, like Dave Chappelle and Joe Rogan and Louis C.K. And I always thought like, oh, like when you get canceled, that only happens to famous people. And it's not like you're canceled. I mean, like you're not going to be homeless and like you and your career is going to take a hit, but it's not going to end you. It's not going to end your career. And then when the New York Times piece came out, I had so many people reach out to me, animators, storytellers, journalists, filmmakers, illustrators that I'd never heard of before, who all said the same thing. Oh my God, the same thing happened to me. And that's when I realized how big this thing was and how far it had permeated into so many different professions. And I had these conversations with people, like long conversations where, you know, we talk about like feeling that our life was over and suicidal and depressed and being abandoned by people we thought were our friends. And it was this kind of common experience shared from people through all walks of life and religions and careers. And they had just all gone through this very same thing. That the way that I describe it to people is, unless it's happened to you, you have no idea. And the way that I kind of equate it is like, I have friends who have kids and I have friends who don't have kids. Now you can read all the books you want about having kids. You can like grow up around like people having kids and like babysitting, but unless you fucking pop that watermelon through that Cheerio and you're responsible for life, like you have no fucking clue. And so I think that when I talk to people who have had this experience, there's this understanding that no one else gets. And I remember I met someone who was, you know, quite famous, and we had a long conversation about his cancellation. And he said to me, you know, no one is going to understand this but other people who've been canceled. You can tell your best friends who know you better than anyone else, but no one actually understands what this is like unless you've gone through it.
Right.
And having all those people reach out to me after the New York Times piece came out and wanting to talk about their own stories made me realize how far this how far this has spread and how really dangerous this was. And also made me realize how oblivious I was about this. Because I had seen people get canceled, in air quotes, on TV, blah, 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 for various things. But I didn't really realize the full extent of it and the toll it takes on you, not just financially, but also emotionally, with your community, intellectually, all these things. You know, like this joke, like they have like the freshman 15, I have like the canceled 35. Like, my body took a hit, like it's all bad. But another thing that happened after the New York Times piece came out is a lot of people reached out and they said, you know, we read about your story and we think it's horrible what happened. We'd really like to help. How can we help? And at that time, you know, I had started it. I just, you know, they're like, do you have a GoFundMe? Can we help you? I'm like, I don't have a GoFundMe, but maybe I should. And so I started a GoFundMe, but this was after all these publications had dropped. And so there wasn't a lot of buzz about it at that point. So I raised like $3,000, which is probably enough to make a poster or something. Because at that point, it was clear to me that distributors were not going to pick up the film because they were still scared about the controversy surrounding it. And when I say controversy, just the bad PR that it got initially. And so I was like, okay, well, then I'm going to have to self-distribute this. But self-distributing a film is really expensive. And I'm not a Disney heiress, so I don't have millions of dollars just to put a film out into the world and put it in theaters and stuff. So I started this GoFundMe to try to self-distribute the film and just to put it in some theaters so people can watch it for themselves and make up their own mind. Like, I just wanted people to watch the thing that I'd spent over half decade making, right?
Right.
And so, and so we raised $3,000, which was not really anything. I mean, it's money, but it's not enough to put it in the theater and do anything with it.
Right.
And then I went on the Sam Harris podcast, and when he put that out without a paywall, that particular podcast went viral, and a lot of people from all over the world heard it, from Greece to Australia to one guy in Botswana or Namibia or something like that, I forget. And in a couple of weeks, the GoFundMe went from 3,000 to $750,000.
Jesus. Oh my God.
And which, you know, I mean, it's not like I can't like studio money, like put the film everywhere, but it was enough to be able to put the film in theaters and take it on tour. So, and we had all these people who were aware of the film. And then, you know, when we announced the US tour of the film, so I'd go to different cities and we'd show the film, and then I'd always be there for a Q&A afterwards. And sometimes we had people moderate it and do the Q&A. For example, Lawrence Wright did the one when we were in Austin. Cara Swisher did the one when we were in DC. We had just, different, Sebastian Younger did one in New York. He's going to do another one again coming up. And it was just these really great conversations that would happen after the film that we just never got a chance to have because it was pulled from all these film festivals. Like what was really upsetting to me is like all these really great conversations that the film was inspiring after people to watch the film during the Q&A and after the Q&A that should have been happening for a whole year at this point. But because the controversy and the attacks on the film getting pulled from all these festivals because they were so scared of the controversy. And that's what South by Southwest said. Like they had accepted the film. I had this glowing letter from the head of South by saying how the film was extraordinary. It was amazing. The controversy happened. And then it was like 2 weeks before it was supposed to premiere at South by, they said, well, because of the controversy of the film, we don't want it that to detract from the other films at the festival. It would be unfair to play your film and to have that attention being taken away from the other films. Like, fuck you. Like, that's not the reason. You just don't want to deal with this controversy. So, when a prestigious film festival like South by Southwest pulls a film, not for legal reasons, but just because they just want to avoid controversy, like it's a really sad state of the world. And what I mean by that is, you watch this film, so you know that this film would never have been made by a studio or a broadcaster. It just wouldn't. It was just so hard and so nuanced and so long to make. No one would actually buy into that to fund a film over 3 years. But also, like, it's a very unique film, and so it could only have been made in the independent space. And traditionally, the place where you platform those kind of films are film festivals like South by Southwest, like Sundance.
Right.
And if now that those places are gone in terms of not wanting to program controversial films, and that's not just in my film, there's been articles since what happened to my film about other filmmakers who've experienced the same thing, then where do these films go? Like, it's very alarming that the place that I thought was safe from this kind of ideology is now being co-opted by it. And even there, you can't play controversial films. And I wouldn't even say that this is a controversial film, but it's been marked like that. But the great thing about what happened with the GoFundMe, and the reason why I say I was very lucky, is because it allowed me to then put the film in the theaters and have the experience of talking to the audience personally, like face to face, not on Twitter, and have these really complicated human conversations that we weren't allowed to have when the film was blacklisted. And so with the money from the GoFundMe, I've taken the film to the UK, all across the United States. We just got back from New Zealand and Australia tour. And, and hopefully putting the film up online soon. But none of that would have been possible without strangers from all over the world just giving money to someone they'd never met. Like, we had one guy write in and he said, I listened to the Sam Harris podcast on my UPS route. And it reminded me of when I was in high school, I was bullied, and I hate bullies. I don't have much, but here's $5 and you give them hell. And it was just like a lot of people, the story seemed to resonate with them on a plethora of levels. And I feel like one of the reasons why I wanted to do so many screenings in so many different cities is because I don't come from money. And so if someone gives me their hard-earned money, I want to be able to say thank you in person. So going to places like, Alabama and Georgia and LA and New York. And I mean, we've been all over, like Denver. We've just the UK and New Zealand and Australia and hopefully Canada soon. It's been a really good opportunity, not just to like have these conversations, but to say thank you. Thank you for listening to my story and helping me put my film out into the world, because without those people and without their donations, it would still be sitting on my hard drive and you probably would have never seen it or heard about it.
Yeah. So I am not worried at all about you. You are way too talented, and that's proven. Your film has gotten way too many outstanding reviews. I think you're penchant for going to dangerous places, your incredible desire to understand the worst people on earth. You're going to find an audience. I mean, whatever you do, I'm totally sure about that. If you keep going, I have no doubt about it. People on this show, my guests, I've had 230 or something like that. Probably half of them have been canceled. I mean, I know this. Yeah. I mean, I've been blacklisted. I've been smeared. I mean, and you're going to come back. I think that the liberal intelligentsia, you know, the people who control the big cultural institutions, they probably won't be cool with you for a while, maybe never, but they are becoming less and less and less important. The Sundances, the South by Southwests are less and less important as cultural institutions, as the internet, of course, has democratized everything. And so it's becoming more and more of a true meritocracy out there. If you really are good and talented, you're going to find an audience because you can go directly to the people now. And so I don't see any problem with you. I think you're going to be great.
I mean, I hope if I from your lips to all those ears here,
I
but
know.
I
Yeah, I
mean,
know.
I think that
Inshallah.
what one one thing that I will say is none of this, and I want to make this very, very clear because I think that a lot of people I've had this like said about me these last couple of months, like, oh, she never is canceled. Look at her. She's on the cover of the New York Times or da da da, or cheats on Sam Harris. I'm like, everyone who was involved in this film left the film when the attack started.
Mm.
By that's not true actually. Most of the people who were involved in the film left the film right after Sundance. There's a couple of people who, like my executive producer, who's Muslim and Yemeni, he stayed with me the longest. He was just kind of like, let's just fight this. Let's just give it 6 months. Let's just fight it because this film and the story's worth it. But most of the people left the film and were like, this is just too much. I'm being harassed. I'm being, they took screenshots of our film at Sundance and then reached out to the people in our credits and threatened them and said, if you don't take your name of the film, we're going to publicly denounce you as an Islamophobic and racist and a white supremacist. And so, again, if you're even a little bit left leaning, the worst thing you could be called is a racist or a white supremacist. And so,
Right.
Our credits went from 400 to 40.
Wow.
So
Wow.
I think for me,
God.
When you say you're talented, when you say you're not worried about me, I want to push back on that a little bit because talent and, the ability to do what you do well means absolutely nothing if you don't have the tenacity to just keep going, which I think what you have to understand is like when you make a film, by the time you're done with that film, you're exhausted. Like I was running on empty, like way before the film ever premiered at Sundance. And I was already burnt out from, I spent over 5 years making this film, 3 of those in Saudi Arabia, which, it was an adventure, but it was also really, really, really exhausting to do that. So, there was a point when I had a conversation with a friend of mine who they just said, just walk away. Like this is not worth it. Like everyone has left to film. It's just you now. You have no resources. No one's talking to you. Like just walk away and do something else. And I remember talking to Abigail Disney. This is way after she denounced me in the film on the phone. And she said to me, just take a year off. Just take a year, travel around Europe and just take a year off. I was like, Abby, I don't have fucking money to just piss off for a year and just like travel the world and like heal myself in Paris. Like I'm poor as shit. Like I have no money and I'm financially ruined by that. She's like, well, just go be a barista somewhere. And I'm like, the fuck?
Says a Disney.
Yeah. I'm like, okay. But I think there was a point, and I would be lying to say like, what you have to understand, and I'm not going to be able to articulate what it's like, but people who I knew for years, who I consider friends, either stopped talking to me or completely denounced me online or just lied about things just to kind of virtue signal.
Wow. And
it wasn't this strangers on Twitter, completely being bullies to me that I actually cared about. It was the people that I knew. And I knew Abigail Disney for 4 years, and she had become a friend. And to have someone that I considered a friend both denounce me and then the film and then stop talking to me and just ghost me, and to have that happen over a couple dozen times, and to lose, like before Sundance, my previous film had won South by Southwest, had won a Student Academy Award. I was listed as Filmmaker Magazine's 25 up and coming filmmakers, and Hollywood Reporter had listed me the next gen. And then my career was doing this. It was going like a rocket ship. And then I got into Sundance and it was about to explode. And then getting into Sundance pretty much ruined my career. And so I had switched. I'd been a firefighter for so long and I had switched careers, and I had to start at the bottom of being a filmmaker and work my way up. And I'd put so much time, effort, and energy into that. I was finally getting somewhere. And then to have all that just come crumbling down because I got into Sundance, because 6 people who saw me on that lineup were upset about it. I mean, it was just like, why the fuck would I want to ever make another film? Why the fuck would I want to continue down this road? Why the fuck would I want to be a part of this community anymore? Like all these are all the things that definitely ran through my mind and that I considered. So I want to kind of push back and say, talent does not equate to success. Tenacity does.
Okay.
And the only reason why I'm here is not because I'm talented. It's not because I'm have resources or have connections. It's just because I've just refused to give up.
Clearly. Yeah.
And so that's why it's just like, in order for me to, like you said, make some kind of comeback, it requires that I continue on.
Yep.
And I'm not going to lie and say I'm fucking tired. Like,
yeah.
I've been fighting this for over 1.5 years, and I'm just like, I just want to fucking nap. Like, it's exhausting. And I think that, a lot of people ask me, how I choose my projects. And before I decide on a film, I always ask myself one question: can anyone, and I do mean anyone else, make this film? The reason for that is twofold. Number one, making a film is fucking hard, especially this kind of film.
Mm-hmm.
And so, your hairline's going to recede, your waistline's going to expand, your social life is going to disappear, and your finances are going to be ruined. And so, if someone else can do that, let them tell that story. You don't need to have that headache if someone else can tell that.
Right.
And if the answer is yes, someone else can tell the story, then you're probably not the best person to tell that story. And maybe there's something else that you should be doing.
Yeah.
And I remember when I first decided to do this project and I asked myself that question, the answer was like, no one else can tell this story. There's no one's ever going to be able to get this kind of access. And no one has this kind of like perspective of being a firefighter on 9/11 and also living in Yemen. And there was a lot of things that made me uniquely suited to tell this story. And so I knew that I was the only one that could. And then also that I was so passionate about the story. If I didn't think this film was important, I would have given up over 1 year ago.
Yeah.
And if I wasn't passionate about this subject matter, it's just not worth it to ruin your life like this. So I'm very selective on the projects I pitch or I choose to work on, because it is a year's commitment. You're giving years of your life to something. And whenever I start a project, it's like, is this worth years of the few years I have left on this planet? Well, and so the reason why I'm kind of still having this conversation with you, that I'm coming to the East Coast to do more screenings, is because I have seen when people watch this film, how their paradigm kind of shifts and the discussions that we have afterwards. And they are so unlike the discussions that I see this, like you talked about, the very polarized discussions we're having. It's the first time in a long time that I've had discussions that were more nuanced and more complex. And I think people are actually really thirsty and hungry for that, because we've been deprived of that for so long. So yeah, I think that I don't think that talent can get you out of something like this. I think that you could have connections, but I didn't have any before any of this. And if any connections I did have, they quickly dried up in a way.
I'm just telling you that I know for sure that there is a tremendous demand for what you do, so that if you do keep going and you do keep making films, you will have an audience out there, and then it's just a question of finding them. But you will have an audience, certainly Saturday,
on the 10th,
June 10th at the Icarus Festival. So yeah, this is one of the very few opportunities to watch this amazing film. So everyone should come check it out. Icarus Fest. IcarusFest.com, June 10th, and we're gonna have amazing panels. Meg will be there.
Who else is gonna be on the panel? I have no idea.
Max Blumenthal, Aaron Mate, Michael Tracy, Clint Russell. These are all podcasters and YouTubers who are really experts, some of the best commentators on the war on terror, on the Middle East, on U.S. foreign policy, all that stuff. So it's going to be really fascinating to watch them and interact with you and with the film. So I can't wait to meet you in person and to do this. But yeah, seriously, please, just for me, just keep going. Okay.
Only for you. No,
just for me.
No, the reason I wanted to say that is I think sometimes, when you see something on the outside, I think you get this kind of surface area of it. It's if you're talented enough, you will come back from being canceled. And I want to basically say a lot of that is,
I know,
people become good because they are relentless, and
Yeah.
people stay in the business because they just
Oh, yeah.
refuse to give up. But you will get hit down, you will get smacked down, you'll get bitch slapped around, and all you have to do, like, I was a competitive boxer for a long time.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, I got, like, isn't it? That's what's in the other room, my belt.
That's my sport.
Oh, really?
I've been training for 15 years. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Are
Never,
you
never,
southpaw?
never competed. No orthodox,
Okay.
but a lot of
Yeah.
sparring.
I competed in the second largest amateur boxing tournament in the US and won. So I have the
Damn.
belt to prove it. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
My co-producer is always like, because in my old office, I had my belt on top of the door when you first walked in. And she's like, you did that on purpose. So anyone who works with you just doesn't argue with you too hard. I'm like, you got it.
Wow. Nice. I like
Yeah.
it.
So
All right. Well, thank you for this. And I can't wait to, again, see you and meet you and screen the film and,
yeah,
and have the audience react to it too. So it's going to be wonderful.
will this come out before the?
Yes.
Okay. Awesome.
It'll come out very soon. Yeah. Thank you, Meg.
Well, yeah, it was nice talking with you.
Yeah. And I'll see you next week.
Cheers.
Okay. Bye. This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the unreported news analysis show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.